Okay, so we're continuing in siman lamed bet. Again, some of this there's an overlap with what we studied in the Ilchot Sefer Torah, but there are some new things as well. So let's see. At first, we'll still be continuing to deal with the klaf, and then afterwards we'll go into the actual issues of the letters themselves, as we will see. So let's look in the Mishnah in the Shulchan Aruch. We were up to seif Yud. And again, the background for seif Yud is that what we mentioned, that at least in the times of the Rishonim, they didn't have Jews involved in the process of tanning the leather, and they would rely on the goyim do it. And we saw, that there should be at least some minimal involvement of the Jew, even when the goy is doing the tanning of the leather, because again, we need ibud lishma. So we said lechatchila that the Jew should put it into the seed, into the line, and then for at least he starts the process of the tanning of the leather, so that makes it lishma. Now the issue that they had was that how could you want to be able to identify that the leather, the parchment that was made is the one that the Jew was involved with, that he instructed the goy to do lishma, not that the goy would switch it with something else. Okay, so that's what the Shulchan Aruch here discusses in seif Yud. He says, כשמסמנים הנקבים במרצע כאין אותיות, אף על פי שנקל אינו יהודי לזייף, אין חוששים, משום דמירתת אינו יהודי, פן יכיר ישראל בטביעות עין. This is a bit similar to the discussions that we have by meat, whether we are concerned that the non-Jew will switch it or whatever. So what they used to do, they used to make like holes in the leather, holes but in the shape of letters, to be able to identify it. Now here the Mechaber says, even though the non-Jew could easily forge it, why? Because he could take this one and put it on top of, let's say, another piece of leather, and just make holes in the same spot, and in that way he'll be able to, copy easily the siman that the Yehudi made. Nevertheless, he says we don't need to be choshesh for that, because he'll be too afraid to do that, because he'll be concerned that even though I forged the siman, nevertheless the Israel will be able to recognize it b'tviut ayin, just by being able to recognize whether this is the one that he was involved with and the ibud lishma, or whether it was switched. Here the Mishnah Berurah brings another solution. He says, ויש אומרים שיכתוב בראש בפנים במקום שאין דרך לאבד הראש, ויישאר הכתב עד אחר העיבוד, ולא יסיימן במרצע מחשש זיוף ובדיעבד יש להקל. In other words, some say instead of making holes, put actual writing, but in a place where, in an area on the leather which is usually not tanned, and that's obviously much more difficult to forge, as opposed to holes that, again, he just needs to put one on top of the other and punctures holes in the same spot. But he says, b'diavad yesh lakel k'shulchan aruch. Again, obviously, if nowadays we're making our own klafim, then we're not doing it by goyim, then obviously we don't have a problem. Again, this whole concern of chalifin, again, this is really more something that appears in Yovedea regarding food, that we're only concerned for chalifim, that the goy will switch if he has some sort of benefit. If he has no advantage to switching, right, that's what here the Orach quotes. He says, so anytime, what's it to him, this leather or that leather, he's not getting any economic advantage. So then we don't need to be choshesh also for the goy switching. seif Yud Aleph, אור שעבדו שלא לשמו, אם יש תיקון לחזור ולעבדו לשמה, יתבאר בסטור יורדיה סימן רישא עין א', that there is an opinion that's brought that even if the ibud was done shelo lishma originally, you can do a second ibud lishma, and that will fix the problem. If you debate, also something that we had in the Ilchot Sefer Torah, he says, יהיה הקלף מאור בהמה וחיה ועוף הטהורים, אפילו מנבלה וטרפה שלהם. It has to be from a species which is tahor. It doesn't have to be from an animal that was shechted properly, just that the species will be a kasher בהמה חיה or עוף. אבל לא מאור בהמה וחיה ועוף הטמאים, דכתיב למען תהיה תורת השם בפיך, ממין המותר לפיך. In other words, from a species which is permitted in eating, so it can't be from any tamei animal. ולא מאור דג אפילו טהור, משום דנפיש זו המי, and not to use the skin of a fish, because that's considered more dirty, and therefore it's not respectable, more smelly. It's not respectable to use that for Kitvei Kodesh. Interesting case here in the Biur Halacha. I don't know exactly how this could actually happen in reality, but I think this is one of these things that are sort of strange discussions that actually could be somehow become relevant in some way or another. Here he mentions a teorim. He says, "Uteora shenilda mitme'ah." In other words, if you have a power animal born from a tamei animal, עיין בתשובת יד אליהו שהעריך והעלה להחמיר. אבל טמאה שנולדה מטהורה מתיר לכתוב עליה. ספר תפילין ומזוזות. In other words, you go by, I think the situation he's describing is that somehow maybe there was some sort of kilaim or something here that the mother was tahor, but the animal that came out does not have the simanim of the behemat tahora or something of the sort. Nevertheless, you go by the mother. Discussion similar, it's not exactly the same, but there are modern day, there are all kinds of discussions because of GMO, right, where you can genetically modify species. So let's say I take a non-kosher fish, but I genetically modify it to have fins or scales. Will that make it kasher? Or the reverse, I'll take a kosher species and modify it genetically not to have the simanim. What will be the halacha regarding that? There are all kinds of discussions on that. Currently, I don't think we actually have, I mean, scientifically it's possible to do that, those kind of things. But at least as far as I know so far, the GMO hasn't raised real kashrut problems. But again, these things have been already being discussed on such scenarios. Some interesting material on that. I think I read once tomatoes that have shark genes in them, but somehow it improves the tomatoes. But again, that everybody agrees that's not a problem. It's still a vegetable. It's not an animal, even if it has some sort of shark genes inside. Okay. Next seif. So here the Mechaber says, יהיה הקלף שלם, שלא יהיה בו נקבים, שאין הדיו עובר עליו, דהיינו שלא תהא האות הנראית בו חלוקה לשתיים. Okay, so first of all, as we will see, there is a difference between whether a nekev is made before you write the letters or whether it's after. And generally speaking, we'll see this later on, we're more machmir about to get the writing properly done initially, then b'diavad, after it was written properly, if something happens, then it's more difficult to make it pasud. In other words, the halachot here differentiate between how you need to write it initially, where we're more machmir to get it written properly initially, as opposed to later on, b'diavad, if after it was initially, then a hole came about or something else happened, there we have more leniencies. Okay, so here we're talking about the initial stage. So you're taking a klaf, so you have to make sure it doesn't have any holes in it. But the exception is nekev she'adio over alav. In other words, sometimes you have a hole which is so small that the ink is able to cover the hole. So there's no hole in the letter itself because the ink is because the hole is so small, the ink is able to stabilize itself above the hole. However, if the hole will be recognizable, it will split the letter into two, then you can't use that klaf, or you can't write on that hole. Okay, here the Mishnah Berurah says, שהוא קטן כל כך עד שמעביר עליו בקולמוס, נסתם הנקב בדיו, ואין הנקב נרגש בקולמוס, כותבים עליו. In other words, if you're able to write over the nekev and you can't see any hole, that's fine. אף על פי שנפל מעט דיו במקום הוא, ונראה נקב דק נגד השמש, כשר. In other words, even if you hold it up to the light, you'll be able to see a hole there because it's not recognizable on by looking at it standardly without holding up to the light, then that's fine. Okay. By the way, here this is one of the proofs that we follow generally in halakha, we follow what's visible to the plain naked eye, not if you hold it up to the sun, or certainly not magnifying glasses or any of these things. אבל אם ניקב כל כך שאין הדיו עובר עליו, פסול שהאות נראית חלוקה לשתיים על ידו. But if it's recognizable that then that's a problem, then you can't use it. ואפילו אם הנקב באמצע האותיות בגגו, בירכו, ודיו מקיפו מכל צד פסול, ואפילו אם עד מקום הנקב יש צורתו. In other words, he brings here in the Orach a bit of discussion on this, but he says, למעשה, even if, you have a letter even without the part that's going over the hole, even before that the letter is complete, or it's somewhere in the letter where it doesn't really affect the shape of the letter, nevertheless, because we're talking about initially writing the letter, you can't have any visible neked. וכל זה קודם כתיבה. אבל אם לאחר הכתיבה נחלק האות לשתיים ילדי נקב, רואים אם יש בצורת האות עד מקום הנקב כשר, כמו שידר בצמוד. Okay, but he says this is all on the initial writing. If you wrote it properly initially, then the letter was split up, but then we look if I have the shape of a letter already complete up to the nekev, and then that's kasher, as we will see later on. Initially, you have to make sure that you're not writing on any holes unless it's such a small hole that it won't be recognizable. סעיף י"ד, הסופרים הזריזים שלושה מיני קלפים. האב יותר לכתוב בו פרשת שמע, שהיא קטנה, והדק ממנו לפרשת ויין שמוע שהיא יותר גדולה ולפרשת קדש. Here he corrects it that it should be not לפרשת קדש, but rather לפרשת ויה כי ביאך. And parashat, in other words, it should be והדק ממנו לפרשת ויה כי ביאך, לפרשת ויין שמוע ולפרשת קדש שהם ארוכות עושים קלף דק מאוד, ובזה יתמלאו הבתים בשווה וזהו לא תפילין. Okay, what's going on here is as follows. Basically, as we said, so we write in the tefillin shel Rosh, right? We have a separate class for each one of the parashiyot. Now the problem is that the parashiyot are of different lengths. So when you roll them up, the shorter parasha will be much thinner than the longer parashiyot. So, but you want to make them all equal. That's the assumption here. So the way to do that is to take different klafim of different thickness. So for the shorter parasha, you make a thicker klaf, and for the longer parashiyot, you make a thinner klaf, so that ultimately, when you roll them up, they'll all come out to be the same circumference, the same width, whatever same thickness, whatever after they're rolled up. And the way you play around with that is by playing around with the thickness of the klaf. Here, the Mishnah Berurah brings another solution. He says the minhag is to do it differently. He says here, ולמרדכי יפה, that's the levush, כתב שהסופרים שלהם עושים תיקון אחר, שכל הקלפים שווים באורך אחד ובעובי אחד, אלא שמליכית גיליונית עם פרשיות קצרות. Another way to solve it is simply that even for the פרשיות הקצרות, you still make the clef the same length as the parasha aruka, and you just have an empty space on that clef. So it can be all the same thickness. Just make them all the same length, and you'll have some more empty space on the clef, and that way they'll all be the same size. I read somewhere in I think it was one of the new Mishnah Berurah, that they claimed in a footnote that all of this is not relevant nowadays. Why not? Because this whole thing about having them the same size was only back in the times where the batim were made of much thinner skins. Okay, because then if you would tuck in other words, in one bite shel rosh, something thicker or something smaller, it was recognizable to the outside, and that's why it would not be hidu, because it was visibly apparent to the outside that the klafim were of different sizes. Okay, this is one of the differences. Nowadays, we have our batim of tefillin are very strong, right? They're very solid. In general, all the poskim speak about this. The modern day tefillin are much more secure. There's much less of a chashash that something will that the clef will deteriorate because they're made of much stronger material. But in the past, the tefillin were of much softer material and more pliable. So therefore, it might have been recognizably visible if the klafim weren't of identical sizes. So that's why I read somewhere that I think that the sofrim still do like it was suggested, but it's not so critical that they'll be the same size each clef. let me skip now to the tour, because now we're getting into a nikiv after it was written. So here are the tour. So here we have some machlokot. Okay, so it says v'im lachar shenichtav nikav betoch ha'ot kasher. If after it was written, then a nikiv came about inside the letter, then it's kasher. Yesh omrim afilu nikav kol tocho. So what's going on here is as follows. Let's say you have a letter which has the inner part of it is blank, like I don't know, a hey or a samech or a mem, any of these letters that have also like a donut. In other words, that there is in the inner part of it is also klaf. So from the Gemara, from the Bavli, it's mashma that if you have a hole inside the letter on the inner part of the letter, then that's not a problem. Even though we have a lachav mukaf gvil, that the letter needs surrounded by klaf, that only applies to the outer side of the letter, but not to the inner part of the letter. However, he quotes here the tour, ובירושלמי משמע שצריך גם בפנים מוקף גביל, הילקח אם ניקב כל תוכו פסול. But from the Yerushalmi, it's mashma that a letter needs to be mukaf gvil not only on the outer part of the letter, but also if it's a letter that has an inner part, like I said, like a samech or whatever, also the inner part needs to be mukaf gvil. So according to the Yerushalmi, if the hole is in the inside of the letter, that's also pasul because it's not mukaf gvil on the inside. ניקב ברגל הפנימי של ה' ואפילו לא נשאר ממנו אלא קול שהוא כשר. In other words, on the left leg of the hay, again, which is detached, the hay is like a reish plus a small leg. So on the smaller leg, if you have a hole there, even if all that's meant left is a little bit, that's fine. Why? Because it still creates the shape of the hay. ניקב הרגל הימיני, however, if the hole is on the right leg of the hay, which is actually part of the bigger part of the hay, אם נשאר ממנו מלאות קטנה כשר ואם לאו פסול. If what's left is still the size of a proper letter, then it's kasher, but if not, it's pasul. Okay, now let's see in the Shulchan Aruch, and we'll see the Mishnah Berurah will explain everything that's going on here. Okay, so here are the Mechaber rules, and he says as follows. אם לאחר שנכתב, ניקב בתוך ההי או המם kasher. Again, so he's speaking about a letter like a hey or a mem that has an inner part. So if you have a hole after it was written that a hole was made in the hay or the mem, it's kasher. Afilu nikav kol tocho, she'anikiv memale kol hachalal, even if the hole takes up the entire inner part of the letter. In other words, certainly if it's a hole that there's still a klaf around it, so the entire letter is mukaf klaf. The entire letter is still mukaf gvil. But even if the hole takes up the entire inner part of the letter, nevertheless, that's still okay. אבל בירושלמי משמע שגם בפנים צריך שיהיה מוקף כלל. But from the Yerushalmi, it's משמע that's no good, because even the inside also needs to be מוקף גביל. ניקב רגל פנימי של hay, if the inner part of the hay, again, that's the left part of the hay, in other words, the detached part, אפילו לא נשאר ממנו כלשהו כשר להראש. In other words, according to the Rosh's understanding, that part of the letter, all I need is for a little bit to remain, and it's still kosher that day. Says the Rama, אבל שאר פוסקים מצריכים כמלוא אות קטנה והכי הלכתה. In other words, that he says, even here by the left part, leg part of the hay, I still need at least the minimal size of a small hay. In other words, it can't be just a speck. It needs to be at least a small size of a minimal size hay, and only then it's kosher, and he rules that way. הכי הלכתה. ניקב רגל הימיני, if the right hand side of the hay is where the hole is, אם נשתייר ממנו ממלאות קטנה כשר ואם לאו פסול. On the right hand, there everybody agrees that if you have at least a small size hay remaining, then it's kasher, but if not, then it's pasul. Okay, now let's see the Mishnah Berurah. We'll try to sort this out because the Mechaber here is not completely clear. So he says as follows. נקדים בית הקדמות ואחר כך נבהר בעזרת השם יתברך. אחד, כל אות צריך שיהיה עליו צורתו ראוי לאותו אות, ואם לאו פסול. וזה אין חילוק אם לא נכתב כהלכתו או אם אחר כך נתקבל. So first thing, every letter has to have the shape of the letter, okay? If the letter now does not have the shape of the letter, even if it was written initially properly, but now if you read it and it doesn't look like the letter, then that's pasul, and no disagreement on that. That's for sure. Okay. And sometimes if we're not clear, as we'll see later on, then you bring a child to read it, see if he's able to read the letter. Bet, כל עוד שאין הגביל מוקף לה מעל ברוחותיה פסולה, ובדין זה יש שני פרטים. Secondly, we have the halacha, as we already learned, that each letter has to be mukaf gvil, it has to be surrounded by klaf. But here there are two details. אחד, דווקא אם לא היה מוקף גביל קודם כתיבה, אבל אם לאחר כתיבה נעשה נקב או קרע סמוך לאות מבחוץ, ועל ידי זה אינו מוקף גביל כשר, כמו שהתברר בסעיף ט"ז בשולחן ערוך. Okay, this is a מחלוקת ראשונים, but למעשה he says the Shulchan Aruch rules that mukaf gvil only applies to when you initially write the letter. If when you wrote the letter was mukaf gvil, and then later on a nekev was created, and now the letter is no longer mukaf gvil, then he says the Mechaber rules later on in Sif Tetzayin that that's a kasher. Okay. The second point, that רוב הפוסקים דאין צריך להיות מוקף גביל רק מבחוץ לאותיות ולא בתוכן חוץ מהירושלמי שמחמיר בזה. According to most poskim, as seemingly to be the pshat in the Bavli, at least the way they interpreted the Bavli, mukaf gvil only applies to the outer part of the letters, but not to the inner part of the letters, except for the Yerushalmi, who's machmir on this. So he says, "Atan navo lever Shulchan Aruch, im lachar shenichtav nikav, atam debifnim ein tzarich lakafat gvil, ולפי זה אם הנקב קודם כתיבה כשר, והיידה נקט אם לאחר שנכתב ניקב, משום דלכתחילה אין לכתוב אפילו אם הנקב באמצע חללו, ואין ממלא תוכו. אבל באמת, אם עבר וכתב, אפילו אם היה הנקב קודם שנכתב כשר ואין צריך שום תיקון. In other words, he says here there's a problem in the Mechaber, because the Mechaber was addressing מוקף גביל בתוכו, but he spoke about a case לאחר שנכתב. So the Mishnah Berurah says no. The מחלוקת on ניקב תוכו applies even if that nekeb existed there prior to it being written. So he says, really, according to most poskim, even if you wrote and the nekev was there initially, and it created a situation where bitoch ha'ot is not mukaf gvil, according to most poskim, that's kasher. Only according to the Yerushalmi, it's no good. The reason the Mechaber didn't bring the case of kodem shenichtav is simply because lechatchila, you should not, if you see that there's a nekev there, you should not write on it lechatchila, even if the nekev will end up being tochot. In other words, we don't do it lechatchila, but b'diavad, if somebody wrote in that way, then it'll be kasher. Okay. Here he brings, however, he says in the next seif katan. Before that, what is considered the inner part of the letter? He says it only applies to letters that have three sides. He says, "Huadin shalot yot shesh lehem gimel tzvanot ve'yesh chalal betocho." Aber kaf pshuta v'kol sheken vav v'chadom elav toch mikri. Any letter which only has two sides to it, then that's not considered the inner part of the letter that we're referring to. It has to have a minimal of three sides, like a kaf in the not a kaf safid, but a kaf in the end of the letter, etc. Okay, and he also says here in Lamed Vav, "Vafilu naga hanikeva ba'ot gufa, kol shenishar srita daka mibachutz kasher den shiur le'otiyot." In other words, if you have a hole in the letter, even if it's cut off most of the letter itself, but in the letter itself just remains a srita, just a very thin line, that's also kasher because there's no shiur to how thick the letters need to be. So as long as you have the shape of the letter, even due to the neck of the letter ended up being very thin, that's still kasher. Okay. Here regarding this Yerushalmi, he says here, he has a simple solution. Let's say I do have a hole and I want to be machmir for the Yerushalmi, then what I could do is as follows. In other words, if I have a situation where the nekev reaches up to the letter, so now it's no longer mukaf vil, I can erase a little bit of the letter, and then I'll have an empty space of klaf, and now I will have made it into mukaf vil. And there's no problem here of chak tochot, because again, I'm not writing the letter using the chak tochot. I'm just ensuring that it will be mukaf vil. Now here, this whole further discussion applies to after it was written. Okay, where we said nikav regel pnimi shel hey, or the outer regel of the hey. So here he says as follows. He says this is not only a case of nikav, it also applies to huadin im nimchak tzat me'adio velo nikav. ודווקא בהי פליג הראש ומכשיר אם נשאר כלשהו בין למעלה מהנקב ובין למטה. דסבר דאין שיעור הנקודה תלויה בה. ואפילו אם כתב ומתחילה רגל קצר כזה כשר להראש. אבל בשאר אותיות כגון ח' וכדומה, גם הראש מודד הרגל השמאלי דינו כמו רגל מני. In other words, all that the Rosh said was that the left leg of the hay is kasher at any sides is only specific to the letter hay, because the Rosh holds there is no shi'ul, there is no proper size for the leg of the hay, and it could be even just a dot, and it will still be a proper hay. However, as the Rama says, shal poskim atzrichim kemlo'ot. He says, so it's talking about the case that there's no problem with kafvir. Okay, והכי הלכתה. Okay, so here the Mishnah Berurah says, מדבריו אלו, משמע דלא להחמיר בלבד כדעת שאר פוסקים, אלא דפשיטא ליה דהלכה כבתאי. In other words, he says, when the Rama here says, והכי הלכתה, it's not a chumrah. In other words, the Rama holds that really the Ikar Adin is not like the Rosh. And even the left leg of the hay needs to have a shiur, a size of a leg. It can't be just a dot. ואם כן, צריך מאוד להזהיר מאוד לסופרים שנכשלים בזה. ובתפילין ומזוזות, דבעינן כסדרן, לכאורה לא מהני שום תיקון. אפילו הטיעונו קורא לו אות, כיוון שאנו רואים שאין לו צורת אות. ובלא זה לא מקרי, לפי דעת אלו הפוסקים כמן בסעיף כ"ה. In other words, so even if you correct it later on, it's still a problem, because it turns out that it wasn't written כסדרן, if it doesn't have a shape of a hay. ומכל מקום נראה דיש להקל על ידי תיקון ודומיה שיקל לפרי מגדים בתה פשוטה, שעשאו מרובה על ידי תיקון על ידי שם. He says, but if we do fix it, then we do have what to rely on, because again, according to the Rosh, it was kasher even without the fixing, so therefore we could be lenient in the case of where the tikun was done, even though it was done later on. Here he says again, also on the last halacha here of nikav regel הימיני, אם נשאר ממנו אות קטנה כשר ואם לאו פסול. Again, and again, according to the Rama, it applies to both legs, but you have to have at least remaining the shape of a letter hay. So even as long as I have at least a shape minimal smaller hay, even though it's smaller than the other letter in the line, but it's still a small hay. It's not that it's not that it's no longer has the shape of the hay. It still has the shape of the hay. Then that's kasher. He says this also applies not only to the length, but also to the width of it. And he says, as we said earlier regarding the width, he says, אם נשאר שריטה דקה שחור כמו ו' או י' דקה כשר, דאין שיעור לעובי אותיות, אלא דבניקב בין בעוביו בין באורכו בעניין של ניקב לאחר הכתיבה. As we said, all the kulot that we're saying here on nikav only apply after it was written. If it was beforehand, then, and we have a nekev that's visible, as we said earlier, then you can't write on it. And it's pasul, the only nekev which is permitted even beforehand is, again, even is betochot, but even that, according to the Yerushalmi, is no good. All right. Okay, next seifim also continue dealing with problems in letters, but we'll leave that for next time. Any questions or comments? Very good.
Yeshua, thank you so much.
All right, have a good day.
You too.